Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Agent Insider. I have a guest with me today, Kevin Henriksen. Kevin, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, this is exciting. We've been trying to get you on the show now for a few weeks, and
we've just been missing each other.
We have been, so I'm glad that we're able to finally nail you down. So before we get started, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about yourself. How long have you been in the insurance industry as a whole?
So I've been in the industry 12 years now, which is crazy to say out loud. So
that is crazy.
I mean, most of that has been commercial. About the last 10 years have been commercial. And probably 90% of what I do now is contractors, kind of small to mid-sized contracting businesses. And so that's my focus at this point. I'm on the sales side.
Okay. So you like commercial insurance. You kind of get excited about that a little bit more than you do on the auto and home side?
Yeah, and I still enjoy the auto and home side, but I definitely I enjoy the commercial side more.
What do you enjoy about doing commercial insurance?
I like there's just a lot of moving parts to a commercial policy. So you're putting this puzzle together, which, I mean, there's still moving parts to personal, but with commercial, there's just so many things to keep in mind. A lot of times you ask a customer what their coverage is or to send the policy, and they send a certificate of insurance with 5 coverage items. And there's a 200-page document that you have to craft together.
Right. Yeah, a lot of people think about that, right? They think, hey, if I have liability listed at this and this coverage listed here, these amounts, they're thinking about the coverage, they think about what the coverage amounts are. But in insurance, as you know, as I know, the devil's in the details. That 200-page packet that nobody takes any time to look at, that's really what's determining your coverage at the time of a claim. So right. What are some of the big, if you will, some of the big pitfalls that people fall into? I don't know if I'm saying fall too many times there, but some of the issues that people run into where they didn't necessarily realize that this was going to be a problem. Let's talk just about on commercial insurance. You work with a lot of contractors. So when it comes to contractors, what are some of the big things that are different? Like, for instance, what triggers claims? Like, what are some of the things that somebody should think about?
Yeah. So I think maybe a good place to start is a commercial general liability policy, and that's mostly what we'll be talking about today. Is rather than the insurance company saying, hey, we're going listing everything that you are covered for, they say, as long as you stay within your trade, we're going to cover you for any damage or injury you cause. And then they take those, what they don't intend to cover, away via exclusions.
Okay.
So, and just a big exclusion that we see often that a lot of companies aren't even aware that they have is called an action over exclusion.
Okay, break that down a little bit, because if I'm not in insurance, I have no idea action over what. So sounds like an action figure. Like, what does that
sounds
mean?
Cool, but yeah, what does it do?
Yeah.
So, what it does is it excludes injury to subcontractors, and a lot of people say, "Hey, what's the big deal?" Employees are covered through workers' comp, which is true. Employees are covered through workers' comp, but and just a little backstory there, back in the Industrial Revolution, there was no workers' comp system. So you had employees working with heavy machinery.
Yep, which was new at that point.
No OSHA, poor work conditions, so employees were getting injured a lot.
Okay.
Their only point of recourse was to sue the employer, which is expensive for them, it's time-consuming. And now the employers had to fight lawsuits for most of their time, or they spent a lot of time fighting lawsuits, right?
Okay, so Industrial Revolution, equipment comes in, people also probably had more accidents because people weren't used to the equipment.
Right.
No regulations on how the equipment was managed, no safety, no workplace safety, and no workers' compensation.
Exactly. So something needed to be fixed. They needed to have a system where employers pay into a fund. Employees can access that if they're injured. And in turn, there's protections for employers where employees, it's very difficult for an employee to sue an employer for a workplace injury.
Okay.
That two-way protection does not exist for a subcontractor. So if a subcontractor gets injured, they can sue the GC or any third party they want.
Huh. So example would be, so I'm the general contractor building a house. We'll just use a house as an example, easy. And I hire a subcontractor to frame the house. And that subcontractor comes in, it's their business, they have employees, they're framing the house, their guy why he's framing the house, falls off the foundation, breaks his back.
Right.
So can't sue his boss.
Nope.
He can't sue the framing company
Nope.
because he has to go through workers' compensation. But you're saying he could sue me as the general contractor.
He can use the general contractor. And we see this all the time when we're quoting other contractors' policies, that they have an action over exclusion or another exclusion that excludes injury to subcontractors. So it's a common claim that happens, and it's devastating. You look at workers' comp rates for roofers, which is who I work with primarily, and the reason they're expensive is injuries are common. So you have this glaring gap in your policy, and a lot of people don't even know that they have it on there.
So that general contractor then is stuck trying to defend himself against a lawsuit. Now the employee's wages are being paid by workers' compensation. So he's getting some money through workers' comp, but I'm assuming he's trying to get some pain and suffering. Mm-hmm. He wants to get, a new car maybe, or pay his house off.
Right.
And he's like, what's the lawyers? I tell people this all the time. It's like, you're the average person, the average customer or consumer of insurance, they don't know all these ins and outs, right? Just the same way as probably some of the people that are listening to the podcast today have never heard of action over. The average framing employee would never think about that. But if they're seriously injured, a lawyer is going to find them, that's going to get a hold of them. You flip through Yellow Pages, you see the billboards on the road about call me if you're hurt. And those lawyers are the ones that are going to pull apart every option that they have, and they just sue everybody.
Right. And here's the thing is, even if you're the GC and you're running a safe job site, even if you did nothing wrong, you're still going to have to defend yourself. And that could be tens of thousands. It could be, could be hundreds.
Yeah.
So
I have seen lawsuits that were dismissed that the person had zero liability in, and it would still be $150,000 to $200,000 by the time you're paying for expert witnesses, right? Like you have to have it evaluated by somebody, a third party, and lawyer fees and all of that sort of stuff, just to get to the point where you can say, yeah, I have nothing to do with this. I have no liability in that. So it is expensive, and that's something to be aware of. So action over, a big hole people don't think about.
Big hole. And, we could do a separate series on every CGL exclusion. Maybe we should do that. Because there's a lot. There's quite a few.
We could name that series Cure for Insomnia.
Totally.
Which is part of the problem, right? Because when you think about it, people, when you get those 300-page policy, nobody wants to read it because you fall asleep halfway through it. But it does matter.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the other big, hot topic items that you could think of, maybe like triggers for claims?
Yeah. So a trigger is basically a company looks at what they call an occurrence, and they say, did this happen while our policy was in force? And you have two main types of families of policies. You have what's called an occurrence policy and a claims made policy.
Okay. So what's the difference between those?
So a claims made policy states that the damage must have occurred while you were insured with the company, and it also has to be reported to them while the policy is in force.
Oh, wow.
So let's say...
So then I could never change companies.
You never change companies. So if you're a roofer, you put on a roof in, say, September, you're on with a claims-made company. A year down the road, you switch to another claims-made company. The roof starts leaking a month after that. You try to turn it into the new company. They say, hey, no, this damage started and occurred before you switched.
Right.
Go back to the company a year ago, say, hey, we have a leak. And they say, no, this was reported afterwards. After the policy canceled.
Right. So how would I change companies? Is there I'm gonna steal a little bit of thunder here. Is it tails, or is there a way that you could endorse the new policy to cover over the old policy?
Yep. So you can buy what's called a coverage tail, which extends that reporting period a lot of times up to like 7 years.
Okay.
So you can buy that and say, hey, that way if a claim rolls in afterwards, we can still turn it into the company.
So that would be the tail that you would buy from your old company when you switch to the new company. Does the new company ever give you the option to change your reporting period, or allow you to, does it ever cover backwards over the old policy?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you can hold a reporting date, a retroactive date, they call it.
Okay.
And some companies will charge for that some won't.
So
Update your coverage.
So if you were on a claims-made policy and you're going to switch to a new policy, it's super important that you make sure you either A, buy a tail from your old company,
Yep.
or B, your new company has a retro date that goes back and covers all the work you did on the old policy.
Exactly.
So those are two things that people maybe not think about and may not be aware of when they're just buying insurance and switching policies, because that switch might have saved you, a few $1,000 a year. It could save you $5,000 a year.
Sure.
But if you're leaving yourself exposed on everything you've done for the last 5 years, it's not a very good deal.
No, it's just not worth it. So that's a claims-made policy. The other more common policy we see for general liability is an occurrence policy.
Okay.
And they say as long as the damage occurred when their policy was enforced, doesn't matter when it's reported, up to the statute of limitations in Washington.
That one's even a lot better then, because I could buy that policy, do my work, and then I cancel that policy. I either buy a new one or maybe I've retired, but that policy is going to cover the work I did during that policy period for 7 years, whatever.
Exactly.
Okay. Seems like that's the way to go then.
That's the way to go. Claims-made policies are cheaper because a lot of times when their policy cancels, they're closing the door on that claims rolling in for that company.
Right.
They're done.
Right. It's easy for the company. They know like, hey, we're done here. We don't think about it moving forward.
Right. Occurrence policy cancels, they might still have years of claims rolling in, so the premiums are higher.
Yeah.
For those policies.
I was just thinking, about a story. I was talking to a friend of mine, Carl, and he has just thinking about exclusions. He's in the insurance business as well, but he had hired a contractor, and the contractor had done some work for him. And while they were re-roofing, they messed up some stuff on the exterior walls, and he got a leak on the inside of his house, and it wrecked his kitchen, and it's like probably $50,000 worth of damage. And he went to open a claim on the roofer who was acting as general contractor, and they had an open building exclusion, which means that if the building was opened up, the roof was opened up for work while you were doing work, any damage caused by that, any holes or openings you made in the roof would not be covered on the policy.
Yep.
Which makes sense from the insurance company standpoint. They're like, hey, if you take the roof off, you expect that there's damage, so we're not going to cover that. But it's kind of a crappy deal for other people for the customer, because then in this case, he's got no coverage through insurance. Now he's stuck duking it out with the contractor.
Yep.
And now the contractor has a big exposure that's not covered by insurance that he's going to end up having to write a check out of his own pocket for.
Right.
So those exclusions, those limitations in the policy can really come back and haunt you.
But yeah, they're everything. I mean, a company on a certificate, they can have a $2 million limit. They can take that all away very easily if you don't have the right exclusions on the policy.
Yeah, thinking about that with subcontractors, right? You talked about action over. What are some of the things that you see that end up happening with subcontractors on a general contractor's policy?
As far as injuries?
No, like as far as like, what are some of those key problems that they run into?
How do you mean?
So like you get the action over and exclusion. So then you could have some issues where, because the general contractor's policy, they're assuming that you as a subcontractor are going to cover everything, right?
Right.
So I've seen some policies that have like deductibles if you have an uninsured subcontractor, or maybe some that have exclusions altogether.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So if you're hiring subs, you need to have a subcontractor agreement that indemnifies you. So we won't go into the legalese on it, but they need to be holding you harmless for any damage that they cause. Mm-hmm. And the sub really needs to add the general onto their insurance policy, which means as an additional insured, which means that if the sub causes damage, the GC is named for the damage they caused in the lawsuit.
Right. So that way the claim is going to go against subcontractor's policy, not against the general contractor's policy.
Right. Or rather, even the subcontractor's policy will extend to the GC
for defending it. Right. Because like if you think about it, just back to the scenario, building a house, the general contractor hires the framers. They frame the house wrong, and it causes damage after the house is completed, the homeowner who hired the general contractor is going to sue the general contractor, not the framing company, because they didn't hire the frame company. They hired the general contractor.
Yep.
So then the subcontractor's insurance needs to protect the general contractor as well. Otherwise, you end up with two claims. And that's a common thing I see. You tell me if you see this very often, but I see it often where the general contractors get a certificate of insurance from their subs, from the subcontractor, and it might even name them as additional insured, but it doesn't name them for completed operations.
Yeah. So that's adding additional insureds for completed operations. A lot of companies have become wary of doing that because the claims amount paid out to also include the GC can be extensive.
Sure.
So, when you're making a switch, you need to make sure that if you're sub, that you are switching to somebody that can offer a completed ops AI endorsement.
Yeah, because just to be clear too, like the difference is ongoing operations means that the insurance company is covering the subcontractor while they are framing the house, while they're on site. As soon as they're done with their part of the project, the additional insured for the general contractor is ended. So they're not going to cover the general contractor at all anymore. The completed ops says even after the job is finished, work is finished, the operations is completed, if there's a lawsuit, they'll cover the subcontractor and they will cover the general contractor.
Mm-hmm. And here's the thing is most of those lawsuits are rolling in once the work's done.
Right, yeah. There's not very many lawsuits that are happening while you're building the house.
No. Pedestrian walks by and something falls off and hits them. But most of it's going to be construction issues.
Right. Construction defect usually does not evidence itself till the project's finished. There's some cases where it might, but typically you see most of those are happening after the completion of the project.
Right.
So, or any other tips that you would say contractors should be thinking about was they're evaluating their insurance portfolio and how they're doing their insurance?
Yeah. We go on, do an episode for each one of these. One thing, I've heard in your previous episodes, you talk about insurance is pulling teeth for a lot of people. And I think the pinnacle of that might be insurance audits.
Oh, yeah.
You've paid premium for a year, now you're getting another bill at the end of the year, right?
Right.
For policy you just paid potentially a lot of money into.
Yeah, that's a surprise.
It is. And it doesn't have to be a surprise. I think could be worth chatting about that a bit.
So what is the audit? What is the insurance company doing when they do the audit?
What are they doing? What are they doing and why are they doing it?
Yeah.
So the insurance company, they decide how much they're going to charge you for a year based on how much work volume you're doing.
Right.
If we're talking about contractors.
Yep.
And they'll base that either on a sales amount, so like gross receipts, or on how much labor that you have.
So like payroll
or subcontractor costs.
Okay.
Even so. And the reason they base it off volume is the more volume you're doing, the more jobs you're completing, the more.
That makes sense, right? Right, yeah. A guy who's got $2 million in sales is doing more than a guy who's got 200,000.
Right. They're taking on more exposure. Also wouldn't be fair for the little guy who's doing 200,000 in sales. You have a home builder doing 20 million and they're charging the same rate for both. So they charge you proportionally to how much work you do. So in the beginning of the year, they say, how much volume do you think you're going to do over the next 12 months? No one has a crystal ball, but you say, hey, maybe I'll do 1 million in sales.
Right.
At the end of the year, say, okay, how much did you actually do? And then they will adjust the bill accordingly with.
So will I get money back if I overguess?
You can. Yeah, there's some policies that they call it auditing down, where they will return premium. For workers' comp policies, they typically return premium. For general liability policies, they don't always. They typically don't for roofers and siding companies and other companies that are with what's called surplus lines.
So those higher risk carriers. So it's kind of important to be careful that you don't want to way overguess. I tell people though too, like one of the things you got to be careful of is if you way under guess, your rate per thousand is you are buying in bulk, right? So they understand that just because you do $20 million of gross sales, your risk is not 20 times that of someone who does $1 million.
Right.
And so they're giving you a discount on that estimated volume.
For sure. Yeah. If you think you're going to do 20 million, don't say you're going to do 5 because you don't want to leave money on the table. You want to project that
right
as accurately as you can up front. So
right.
You get a better composite rate.
Right. So you're not going to go, hey, right, because your rate per thousand, if you say I'm going to do 5 million, even though in the back of your head you're like, I got 20 million planned, but I don't want to overpay, so I'll just say 5 million.
Or I don't want to pay it now.
Right. So then I'll deal with the audit later.
Yeah.
And then, so you say 5 million, and I'm just going to pick some numbers, and we'll say your rate per thousand is $30.
Yep.
And so they charge you your rate per thousand at 30 on the 5 million, and then on the audit comes and you did 20 million. Well, you did 4 times what you projected. They're still charging you that $30 per thousand.
Exactly.
Whereas if you had said, hey, I think I'm going to do 20 million, and then you put that in there, and your rate per thousand is going to go down. It's not going to be $30. Maybe it's $20 per thousand. But they don't give you that rate on the audit. They only give you that rate if you project that up front.
Yep.
So I always tell people, like, hey, let's be conservative. Don't tell me what you would love to do, right? Like, I'd love to do $100 million. Sure. But let's tell me what you think is reasonable. What kind of stuff do you have lined up now to do? And let's project off of that.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And the other thing that we walk through with our customers, what's almost more important than that annual rate that they give you based on your estimated amount of sales you might do, is what your charge rate is. So what your charge rate is per unit of sales that you're going to do. So for a roofer, they might say, okay, for every $1,000 of revenue, we're charging $10 in premium, which is just 1%. So for every $1 million in sales, we're charging $10,000 premium.
Right.
You really need to know that and calculate into your bids, because say, hey, 1% of my bid is going to insurance cost. At the end of the year, then it's not a surprise.
Right. It really doesn't matter if you know that number. It really doesn't matter what your audit is, because you've already built for that, right?
Right.
So then if you're like going to be super sophisticated with how you're going to do your bids, you would say, hey, if I'm going to bid, $100,000, a $100,000 job, I'm going to go 1%. So I'm going to go to $1,000 of that 100,000 is going to insurance.
Right.
And maybe I even split that out into a separate account, or in my accounting software, I'll break that down so I know that money's set aside for insurance. And then when I'm bidding, right, like you're going to do the same thing with your labor. You know how much labor rate is going to cost you. So you build that into your bid. You should do the same thing with your insurance. Whatever your insurance rate is, it is. Build that into your bids. It shouldn't come out of your pocket. It should be part of your line items when you bid. Now, you may not break it down for your customer to show them you're charging $1,000 for insurance, but on the backside, when you're building your bid, you should have that built into every bid.
For sure. It's just one more expense, just like anything else is. It just needs to be baked in.
Right. You're baking in your labor rate. You're baking in, your B&O tax rate. If you're in the state of Washington, you're paying B&O. If you're paying income tax, you're baking all that in there. So just put the insurance in there too.
Yep. And then it's not a surprise. It's not going to be a cash flow hit.
Right. At the end of the year. All right. Well, hey, as we wrap up here, I wanted to ask you 2 things, and they might be similar. Maybe they're different, but 2 things. One would be, what advice would you give when someone's looking at commercial insurance to be aware of? And 2, what advice, because you have a baby on the way.
I have a baby.
So that's exciting. I'm glad that we got you on the podcast before the baby comes.
Might be a minute.
Yeah. So what advice would you say that you've picked up over the last 12 years in business that you would want your son to know, hey, this is important in life? Not necessarily just insurance, but in life. So what would you say that people should be aware of when it comes to insurance? Might be the easier question. And then what would you say you'd want your son to know, like, hey, this is important in life?
Yeah. So, I mean, as far as if you're looking at changing insurance and you're a business owner, you're looking at getting quotes, don't look at those 5 items, just your basic. Don't look at just costs or my 5 coverage items, say $1 million limit, $2 million here. You need to look at every nook and cranny of the policy, and ideally you should have the broker that's quoting it take a look at the policy, and then you're passing on some of that responsibility onto them,
right?
Making sure it's the right decision,
right?
For you. As far as recommendation for life,
that's a big question, isn't it?
It's a big question. I think for me, I'm guilty of this, of just constantly thinking forward and backwards, but not just being in the present. So just enjoy whatever's going on right now.
Yeah. That's a good take right there, I think. Because we get so busy in life, right, that we're either, I've heard people say that, right? Like, you're focused on the future and you're focused on the past, right? Like we get twisted up about things that happen, like, oh, I regret this, regret that, or whatever, or I'm worried about what's going to happen in the future. And as a result, we miss out on the now.
Yep.
And I think that's a good takeaway. So a couple of things, and if I'm just going to recap from our conversation on commercial insurance, there's different types. There's claims made, there's occurrence, there's retro dates, there's tails, things to be aware of. There's triggers for what starts the coverage. There's a lot of exclusions that get built into policies. Devil's in the details when it comes to an insurance policy. The 200 pages matter. And I think that your final takeaway there is really important, is if you're shopping your insurance, give that broker that you're talking to a full copy of the policy and say, hey, here's what I have. Take a look at it and make sure that whatever you recommend flows with what I have and is as good or better, because you're putting some onus now on that new broker who's giving you a quote. And not that you would just blindly trust anybody that, any slick willy that comes through is like, yeah, this is going to be so great. But now they have some skin in the game, right? And we as insurance agents, we carry some errors and omissions, because if we screw up, we have our own insurance.
You don't want to use it.
You don't want to have to use it. So I think that's a good idea, making sure that they are aware of what you have, because otherwise they could be quoting you a Rolls Royce and you're driving a Yugo, or they could be quoting you a Toyota Corolla and, you are currently driving, a Tesla. So,
exactly. Yeah.
So you want to make sure that it's not just the devil's in the details. So just those liability limits and building and contents coverage limits are not necessarily telling the whole story.
Yep.
And then the second thing is just being present. And I think that's important both in business and also in life. It is in anything that you do, be present where you are. Tomorrow is going to happen. Yesterday's over. Enjoy the people that you're with. Enjoy the people that you're around. Be part of the life of the people that you're with. I think that's great.
Yep. And, tomorrow might not happen. Right?
It might not. You worry a lot about tomorrow, and it's not promised.
A lot about 30 years from now.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, thanks for joining me, Kevin. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. If you have questions, as always, send me an email. The email address again is theagentinsider@gmail.com. Thanks so much, and have a great day.